Parshas Bamidbar. I'm recording this from Eretz Yisrael. I'm in Ramat Beit Shemesh, and I ask that everyone specifically include tefillos in their Shemona Esrei and special tehillim for the situation that we should suffer no further loss or damage, and we should be victorious over our enemies and restore bitachon, security, and also reliance on HaKadosh Baruch Hu quickly to the land. Parshas Bamidbar begins with a description of the counting, of a counting. And the Torah begins with the pasuk that says, Vaydaber, or rather this parsha begins, Vaydaber Hashem Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'ol moed. So Hashem spoke to Moshe in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting, when? B'echad l'chodesh hasheni, on the first of the second month. The second month for these purposes is Iyar, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan Tammuz, so it's Iyar. In the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. B'shana Sheni, let's say some Eretz Mitzrayim. More. So Rashi introduces this notion. The Torah hasn't yet described the counting, but Rashi anticipates it and says, Mitochi basan lefanov mona oso kosha, because of the dearness of the Bnei Yisrael, so he counts them every now and then. And among the times, he mentioned several times in which there's a counting, and among the several times is be'echad be'ir. Okay. The next pasuk is where we get the unusual language. Now, the typical language for counting is pakod. Ele pekudei, vayifkod, pakad. That can mean remember also, but that's the typical term for counting. But here we have su'u es rosh kol adas b'nei Yisrael mishpal. Some take count or take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel by their families, by their fathers' houses. B'mispar shemos kol zachor l'gugol. Some according to the number of their names, every male one by one. There's a very loaded pasuk. It's a loaded verse. This is chapter 1, verse 2, Perak Aleph, pasuk beis. But what I'd like to focus on now is this phrase of su'u, of lift up. So there are a number of, or rather, introducing this concept as being an unusual form for counting, not rare, but it's not the typical form, is the language of su'u. Now, typically we retranslate that to mean lift up. Vayisa ena vayar. He lifted up his eyes. Kasher yisa ha'omen esayonek, like the nursemaid will carry, or the caretaker will carry the suckling, the child, the infant, or Vayisa Raglav, he lifted up his legs, or Yisa Hashem panav elecha, Hashem should, it's a bracha, Hashem should lift up his face to you. So how does su'u mean count? So I recall my Rabbi Rav Soloveitchik used to say that there are methods of counting that can dehumanize a person if you become just a number. And we have had periods in our history, dark periods, in which Jews were only considered by the authorities to be numbers. And one can count and to be inclusive and to lift up someone in the course of counting. And that's why you really, there's a prohibition against counting people. We either count Maxis HaShekel, or some of Forshim say we count names, but we don't count peoples. I recall when I was growing up in Detroit, in Yeshiva Space Yudah, the teachers used to count people. He would say, not one, not two, not three, not four. That was their way of signaling that they weren't counting. Sometimes you count legs and divide by two. Okay. Count noses, whatever. You're not counting people. As a matter of fact, according to some Meforshim, David HaMelech ran into problems by counting, not necessarily counting people, but counting unnecessarily. And that's another issue, which is, when is it appropriate to count? So the Meforshim talk about it, and they say whenever the count is for a purpose, for example, to allocate nachala in Eretz Yisrael, portions of the land for inheritance in the land of Israel, that's appropriate. Sometimes they say if it's to count to determine positioning and groupings within the army, it's appropriate. Some of the Meforshim are critical of David HaMelech, who got into trouble for counting because he just wanted to know, they say, how many people he was king over. that is not considered to be an appropriate form of counting. So anyway, we have counting here, and we have the language of su'u. Now the Ramban comments on this, and he cites a Rashi which he had, which is not in our standard printed Rashi. Evidently, he had it, and he quotes Rashi that says, "Kamosha Omer le kistinar orim reishe deploni," like someone would say to the executioner, "Lift up his head," meaning execute him. And the Ramban says, I don't understand why the term of su'u is viewed negatively. There are times, he observes, when the term is a negative one, but there are also times when it's used positively. For example, concerning Yosef's interpreting the dreams of Paro's cupbearer and his interpretation of the dream of Paro's baker. In Sofer Bereshis, Perek Mem, Pasuk Yud Gimel, that's 40:13, Yosef is quoted as saying to the cupbearer, the Saramashkin, Ba'od Shloshos Yamim, Yisa Paro es Roshecha, Paro will lift up your head, V'hashivcha al kanecha, and he'll return you to your position. And then later on, when he's shortly thereafter, when he's interpreting the dream of the baker, he says, Ba'od Shloshes Yamim, Yisa Paros Roshcha Me'alecha, V'Soloscha Eitz. In 3 days, Paro will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a tree. So we see that lifting up a head doesn't necessarily refer to the act of execution or any other physical act, but rather it means we pay attention. And paying attention is another way of saying that you're being noticed. So you could be noticed for good. You could be singled out by a boss or by a teacher for having done something good, or you could be singled out for not having done something good, for having done something bad, for having performed poorly by a teacher, by a parent, by somebody else in authority. Now, the Ksav Sofer was the son of the Chassam Sofer. He succeeded to the Chassam Sofer as Rosh Yeshiva in Pressburg. So he observes, he quotes the Ramban, and then he says that he thinks the problem of the Meraglim, when they entered, the scouts or the spies, when they gave a bad report for Eretz Yisrael, is that they lacked self-esteem. It's not that they lacked emunah or bitachon in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and confidence in the Almighty that He could deliver the land into the hands of the children of Israel, but rather they knew that they had sinned. They were part of the community that had sinned in the Chet HaEgel and the sin of the golden calf. Now, they weren't the actual worshippers of the golden calf. Those had been killed. But rather, they came from the society that enabled that worship to happen. And they had low self-esteem, low spiritual self-esteem. They felt they were not worthy. And as a result, they felt that they would not be worthy for the Yeshua of Hashem, for the salvation of God in the conquering of the land. And they said, we can't do it. They think we're grasshoppers. We think we're grasshoppers. We think we're lowly bugs. We're not going to be able to do it. And the Ksav Sofer says that this is a limud zchus on the Meraglim, that they weren't challenging God. They had a low impression of themselves. And now he quotes Rashi, and Rashi says, but God only counts people when to show his chiba. He shows their chiba. It's not only counts, but when he counts Bnei Yisrael, for example, after a magefa, after a plague, or for other purposes, it's to show mitoch chibasan. It's to show how dear they are to him, which means despite their having been in some way complicit or having not objected to the sin of the golden calf, nevertheless, you're okay, you're on my team. You're in the count. And the Meraglim did not see it that way. And this, for us, I think, is a lesson that it is a good thing to be humble. But if you're so humble that you take yourself out of the game, it can lead to sin. I'm reminded of more than one basketball game that I've played in which somebody blows an easy layup, for example. It's an easy shot. They could have made a basketball. They could have put some additional points on the scoreboard, and they didn't, and they beat themselves up. not literally, but they brood, and they brood right after the event, and they're angry at themselves. How could I have done it? And in the meantime, the rest of the team, now possession is transferred because they blew the shot. The rest of the team is at the other end of the court, and now guess what? His team is missing a person. Who are they missing? Him, because he's too busy in self-pity to be back in the game. And now his team is outmanned 5-4 instead of it being 5-5. He's not providing the necessary manpower that he's on the court for. And this is a problem when people wallow in their deficiencies. The notion of being counted by a Kodesh Baruch Hu, Su'u es Rosh B'nai Yisrael, and Rashi says, Mitochi basam monosam, lift up the heads. Yes, they committed, or at least they enabled, or they contributed in some way, even by silence, to the service of the golden calf. Yes, they were deficient, but they're still my people. Even after we sin, af al pi shechotu, we are still the children of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we must not wallow in our self-pity, in our self-accusations, but rather we have to pick ourselves up. Sheva yipol tzadik v'kom, person can fall, a righteous person can fall many, many times, 7 times, many times. You get up, you get back in the game, and you do what you can to continue being a true Eved Hashem, a servant of the Almighty. Have a good Shabbos. Best wishes from Eretz Yisrael, and may we all hear and see Yeshuos, V'nachamos, and deliverance, B'karav, B'yameinu, very, very soon. Have a good Shabbos.